Hello YouTube! Today we're going to try and figure out whether or not eating bugs is the secret to getting jacked. The reason why I'm bringing up the topic is because there has been a ton of talk lately on the internet and in the media about bugs. Nowadays it seems that it is trendy to eat insects, and many people even want you to believe that it's the food of the future and that in the next 10, 20 years everyone is going to eat bugs. I'm going to be honest with you. I went into this video thinking it was going to be a meme and I was going to be done in 20 minutes, but I ended up going down a rabbit hole of very interesting information in reality, and so I decided to share with you guys. I have 3 pages of research and arguments to share, so it's going to be a long video. But because I understand that some of you only care about the nutrition aspect of the insect discussion, I'm going to start with that, and then we're going to discuss the spirituality and the most interesting things in my opinion. I personally encourage you to stay until the end because I think that in this case, the philosophical and ethical aspect of eating insects is much more interesting than the nutrition. But because I'm also interested in whether or not eating bugs is going to make us jacked, because apparently they're full of proteins, we are going to start with that. I'm going to try and remain as neutral as possible, because if you look at the type of discussion surrounding the topic on the internet, you will quickly realize that it is a very polarizing topic. Many people are 100% for and many people are 100% against. And there are not many voices in the middle. I want to be that voice in the middle. Because when I look at both sides, I see extremes. On one side, I see people who tell us that eating insects is going to save the planet, that it's going to make us better people, that it is the ethical choice, and that everyone who resists it is a monster and wants to kill the environment. And then on the other hand, I see people who think that this entire thing is a conspiracy by the New World Order in order to enslave humans, to humiliate us, and to turn us into bugmen. So we'll see. I'm going to keep an open mind. We're going to just look at the arguments, look at the information available, and at the end of the video, I'm going to go back to these 2 arguments, these 2 theories, and we're going to see which one is more plausible and which one is just a pile of shit. So let's start today with the summary and the way we're going to do things. So as I told you, we're going to start with discussing the legitimacy of insects as a protein source. And then we're going to move on to the ecological and philosophical considerations that come with consuming bugs to answer the following question: should you eat the bugs? And is the eating of the bugs going to make you jacked? So let's start with the protein content of insects. On average, 100 grams of bugs gives between 9 to 35 grams of proteins, while meat offers 16 to 20 grams. Based on these numbers alone, we already see that insects have a wider normal distribution, meaning that some species are going to be much more advantageous. This means that if we're going to talk about eating the bugs, it's only going to be a select number of bugs. Other bugs are garbage. They are low in protein, low in minerals, they are very tough to digest, and on top of that, they tend to be disgusting. So you'll see that the industry, the insect industry, focuses on certain superstars, like for example, worms. Worms are high in protein, they are easy to consume, and they tend to have an okay taste. Same for crickets. Most people, the first insect they will eat when they try eating insects is going to be crickets or grasshoppers. Usually crickets because they are smaller, they look less threatening. In comparison with meat, which in general tends to be a more reliable source of protein. If you eat an animal, especially a mammal for the most part, or like chicken or stuff like this, you can't go wrong. It's always going to be relatively high in protein. But this also means that the number one source of protein that you can get in terms of raw numbers is still going to be insects. So that's 1 point for insects, right? Based on the numbers that we see, they are higher in protein. Of course, this doesn't take into account the fact that insects are much smaller. So to be able to get 35 grams of proteins, for example, you're going to have to eat a mountain and a pile of bugs, whereas you could be eating a little bit of chicken or beef and it would give you the same amount. It's important to consider because when you're going to compare 2 food sources, you have to bring them back to the same scale. Now, this is for, again, the raw numbers. But as you know, the amount of protein in a food source is not the most important thing. What's important is how much of it can you digest and actually process. This is what is known as bioavailability. The bioavailability of a protein source makes or breaks it. The reason why whey protein is so sought after and so popular in the gym culture is because the bioavailability is almost 100%, meaning that you can absorb most of it. It's also why many people say that a vegan diet is not possible, because many vegetables, even though they are high in proteins, tend to be poorly bioavailable. You struggle to digest and absorb the nutrients. And on top of that, you have to consume more volume of food to get the same amount of protein, so animal products seem to be superior. We are also dealing with the same thing here. But in this case, insects have something on plants, and that is the fact that they are extremely bioavailable. I even found studies showing that insects are more bioavailable than meat, and that is saying a ton. It is even possible to find certain studies that show that cricket powder is apparently 50% more digestible than whey protein. I read the entire study. Technically, it should show it's more bioavailable, but most of what it actually proved is that cricket protein was faster to absorb and not necessarily better overall. But it's still insane when we know that whey protein has the highest bioavailability of all protein sources. So for now, it seems to me that insects are an excellent source of protein. So far, so good. But, and there's always a but, the information that I gathered was mostly published by certain outlets like Adidas, Men's Health, GQ. I am trying to look at the logic and the soundness of the arguments, because I have found an almost entire consensus when it comes to insect protein, which should be concerning. When every single news outlet says the exact same thing, it is your responsibility as a conscious consumer to look into it and to find if they are maybe in cahoots, if maybe the entire thing is just a mafia. So, because they all tout insects as the superior source of protein, this must mean that there is a catch. And there is a catch. This is the grain of salt that is caught in the cogs of the machine. And that is the fact that bioavailability, for the most part, is a sales argument. A sales argument is something you present to the public to actually convince them to purchase the product. Most of the time, studies about bioavailability tend to be all over the place. I have found whey proteins that touted a bioavailability of 150%. Do you believe that this is legitimate? And if we go back on the claims of the cricket protein, cricket powder is apparently 50% more bioavailable than whey protein that is already at a ratio of 100. What does that even mean? It doesn't mean much, and it's because the studies, for the most part, don't reflect the reality of the situation. So I'm going to try and explain to you the reality of the situation. But first and foremost, before we dive deeper into the bioavailability, I think there is another aspect that needs to be discussed. Probably the most important aspect in reality, even more important than the nutrition profile of the food, and that is the taste. Even if you have something that is absolutely nutrient full and that is going to give you all of what you need in a day, if it tastes like turds, no one is going to want to eat it. And this is something that I never saw covered in any of these articles. It was always a subject that these people dodged like the plague, and that is because if you start bringing taste on the table, you quickly realize that insects are losing because, and I speak as someone who has been eating insects way before the hype, insects are disgusting. As they are in the source where you can find them, an insect is not made to be consumed. They have no fat, they have exoskeletons, whatever meat that they have has no taste, or if it has a taste, it's a bad taste. There is a reason why people have always favored other types of proteins and other animals. It's because they taste better. The animals that we turned into farm animals for the most part became farm animals because they tasted the best. The rest we don't eat. Right? We don't eat carnivores for a reason. Is it because they're not farmable? No, we could farm wolves if we wanted. But have you ever tasted a carnivore? They taste like garbage, and it's the same with insects. They are disgusting, and that's the reason why when you try to purchase insect snacks you can get on the internet, you will quickly find out that they are covered in artificial flavors, because if they weren't, you would never actually eat them. Whereas food, steak, like for example, can just stand on its own. You cook a steak even without salt or pepper, it's delicious. This is something that is going to come back later, and keep it in mind. Insects, for the most part, are going to require more processing to be digestible to humans, but also to be consumable by humans. And that is going to be a very important point when we start talking about ecological impact. Now, let's join the topic of taste and bioavailability. We're going back to it. When we discuss bioavailability, it's important that we distinguish between raw and cooked, because any discussion about insects and their nutrition value and profile when fresh and raw is useless and worthless, and I have seen articles trying to use them as such, and you just can't, because no one is going to eat raw insects. It's already tough to make people eat cooked insects, so forget about it. You're not going to just swallow a worm living or like a living grasshopper. That sounds absolutely disgusting. So the bugs will need to be processed before being consumed. And this is when problems start to arise, because I found studies that showed that boiling insects, just boiling them briefly, reduced the bioavailability of proteins by 25%. So we go from roughly equivalent to whey protein, which is 100% in forms of powder, and around 90% of bioavailability when it's just the raw insect, to now minus 25%. So we are now around 60%. That's fairly low now. We are much lower than most protein sources that you can find in turkey, in cattle, in eggs, etc., etc. This is something that must be mentioned. But that is for boiling. Boiling is one of the worst ways you can actually cook insects. Roasting has been shown to be much more efficient. So maybe roasting will be the way to go for people who lift and who want to get jacked. After the gym, instead of having a barbecue with ribs or whatever, you'll just put crickets on the barbie and you'll have a nice cricket barbecue. But it's not all. It's not just protein that suffered, it's also other minerals. Things like iron and zinc lost almost 50% of their bioavailability during the cooking process, and that also included rusting. So you lost a ton of minerals. Now, you could tell me that it's the same for pretty much every other food source. Even vegetables, if you, for example, you cook them in a pot, they're going to lose a ton of the vitamins and minerals in them, and that's perfectly normal. I just wanted to point it out because it's important to compare bugs with other food sources, because they're going to be treated the exact same. Meat is the opposite. Meat is one food source that, when cooked, tends to increase in terms of nutrition profile. It's not always the case, but there is a reason why we cook our food. It is easier to digest, it saves energy, and it makes it easier to absorb. And there are also studies that show that cooking a piece of meat increases the bioavailability of protein and amino acids. An important factor to consider, because, as I said, insects will be consumed cooked in the West. So they're going to be consumed just like meat. And when we bring it back to that and we consider that factor, we see that in terms of total number of protein and of bioavailability of same protein, it's pretty much the same. Kiff kiff, as we say in French. It's not going to be the best protein source, but it's not going to be terrible either. And we're going to see that all of that protein consideration is really useless. People who push insect consumption don't really care about it. They just try to open with that because they know that they're talking to people who obsess over protein. So it's a mirror argument. It's an entry-level argument. And then the real argument starts. You're going to see that if we come up to the conclusion, like I just did, that insects are still a worthy replacement, then almost 90% of the job is done, and then the real discussion is going to start. Since now that we have seen that insects are far from a perfect source of protein but can serve as one, we need to discuss the ecological impact of switching from meat to bugs. It's what I personally call the vegan 1-2 punch. If you ever had a discussion with a vegan, they always open with health. They always try to tell you that if you start becoming vegan, you're going to have better health. That is their entry-level argument, their mirror argument. This is just the surface. They don't really care about that. What they really care about is the second punch. And the second punch is morality and sustainability. Mostly morality. Most vegans are concerned with that. They're not really concerned with their health. It's more of an ethical choice, and they sort of attach to that questions about the environment and the ecology because it correlates with their moral standpoint and not the other way around. It's very rare to meet people who want to save the planet and went vegan. It's more like your heart and your empathy towards animals made you become vegan, and then you also find out that it potentially is also the best way to save the planet and to ease the strain put on the environment. And that's a nice argument you can utilize for yourself to justify your choices, but also to convince other people to embrace the vegan lifestyle. It is the same with eating bugs. So it starts with protein. Oh, they're great for protein replacement. And then if you don't buy into the argument, they're going to move on to the morality and the sustainability. So according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and I already see some of you raising an eyebrow when you heard UN because you think they're the devil. I don't agree or disagree. We're going to see what they have to say. Insects require 6 times less feed than cattle, while also producing significantly less greenhouse gases, and it takes less time and land to raise them. So just based on that, if we believe our good old friend Klaus, we should all eat the bugs, right? Why aren't you eating the bugs right now? You bigot. We can save the planet. Clearly, they are so cheap to produce. They don't pollute at all. I mean, at this point, raising cows is just a waste of time. Even from an economical standpoint, why are we still doing that? Why aren't we all raising bugs? Why don't you raise roaches in your bathtub, for example? You could cut down on your meat consumption almost 100%. Well, it's because, of course, it is not that simple. When an official organization like the UN tells you something, don't take it at face value and try to think logically, try to access information and compare data, which is exactly what I did. So I'm going to take every argument that they said and I'm going to offer counter-arguments. So first and foremost, insects require 6 times less feed than cattle, okay? Keep in mind that 86% of cattle feed is agriculture byproducts that are inedible for humans. So these are things that cannot be consumed. It's not like we're raising pristine vegetables just to feed to cows. It doesn't work like that. For the most part, this is food, veggies, that are produced on soils that serve to grow vegetables for human consumption, and then the byproduct of that, which is a fair percent, is given to the cows for them to eat. So 9/10 of all that they consume to grow, that is considered cattle feed, is in reality things that would have been thrown in the garbage. If you add to that the fact that there are vegetables sold to humans in supermarket that when they reach expiration date are sold to farmers that they then feed to their pigs, to their cattle, the number is higher. So it's a little bit disingenuous to say that insects require less feed. However, it is also true that, and we're going to get back to that, insects eat pretty much the same thing as cattle and livestock does, to the point that insects also serve as a way to get rid of food that should otherwise be wasted. But we're going to get back to that because it's also an argument for insect consumption. All right, let's move on to the next point. The next point being that it takes much less space and land to raise insects. That's of course obvious. They are so much smaller. I just want to point out the fact that the land that people consider when they talk about raising livestock also includes the land used to raise the food consumed by humans that is then fed to them. So it artificially increases the land usage, but it is true, and this is the one argument that's a killer argument, especially in this new eco-friendly environment we live in, where people are much more aware of their impact on the planet, that insects, bugs, produce almost no greenhouse gases. Some insects don't even have a digestive tract, so they can't digest, they can't produce methane, whereas cows do. They belch all the time, they produce these gases, etc., etc. And this is something that is often pointed out by people who want to start eating the bugs. Not only is it going to be apparently a better source of protein, but it's also going to be a source of protein that doesn't pollute to produce, and even when they're alive, they don't pollute. So it seems like the obvious choice, because if you look at the number, livestock is responsible for around 40% of all greenhouse productions in the world. However, with numbers and stats, you always have to look at distribution. This number also take into account transportation, right? It's taken into account. So you take a cow and you say you produced a ton of greenhouse gases. Well, the cow produced maybe, I don't know, like 10% of that. The rest, the 90% rest, was transporting the cow, getting the cow to this place, getting the food to the cow, etc., etc. It is also disingenuous to say that it is the cow's fault, it is the industry around it. But technically it's the same, right? If the livestock industry and the cattle industry pollutes, even if the cow doesn't directly pollute, it's still pollution. Pollution is still occurring, and on top of that, if you add the fact that they belch, well, it's an extra bonus. But belching by itself in the US produces around 3% of yearly greenhouse gases to the 0% of insects. So it's still something, but you can't say that 40% of all greenhouse gases is produced by animals living. No, it's the things around them. I say that because, just like with the cooking thing, insects are also going to require transportation, just like they also require to be cooked. So you cannot compare insects in their pristine state, like completely separated from the industry or from a cooking process, and food, livestock that need to be cooked, transported, etc., which again, all of the articles I read did. It's just not a proper way to compare data. So if we compare it properly, you have to keep in mind that transportation was responsible for 27% of all gas emissions in the entire world, okay? And since insects also require to be transported, only looking at their natural production is unsound, because you, me, whoever, we're not going to go out in the world and pick insects. It's just not going to happen. You're going to get them from somewhere. It's going to be delivered to your house. You're going to drive your car to the supermarket and get them if they ever get sold in supermarkets. This still pollutes. It's still transportation, and the 27% of all emissions will also encapsulate the emissions produced when people go to buy their bugs. And this is especially evident right now because the West imports most of the bugs they eat. There are factories that start producing bugs directly on the territory, especially in Eastern Europe, but I checked the numbers. Deutschland, for example, I said Deutschland, we say les Pays-Bas in French, Amsterdam, all of that stuff. They imported 70% of their bug production. Now, within that was bees, it was killer assassin bugs to help with protecting the crops, etc. But some of that was also for eating. So this also increases greenhouse gases emissions. It is still transportation. So at this point, we see that when we bring the protein sources, the insects and the meat, to the same level, we realize that the problems caused by the consumption of meat is going to be similar to the problems caused by the consumption of insects. So it's not going to make much of a difference. So now we have two products that have roughly the same protein profile, and then you try to come up with ethical arguments or ecological arguments to say that insects are going to be better, but they're only going to be slightly better because they don't directly produce greenhouse gases. So it's a complicated question. But let's keep discussing it because I'm far from over. So this part is a little bit more tricky for me because I have numbers all over the place here because the research got crazy. But let us continue. We also spoke about the fact that, again, it takes less resources to produce insects. And that could be, again, a killer argument. This could be the one that is tipping the balance in favor of insects. Because raising insects require less land, as we already say, because they're smaller, time, because they reach maturity faster, and resources, and this is the one that I want to focus on. Because it takes 2 kilos of food to produce 1 kilogram of insects, whereas it takes 8 kilograms of food to produce 1 kilogram of beef. We have seen that the food that the beef and the insect is going to eat is going to be fairly similar. So in this case, there is a clear advantage in terms of insects. It is much easier to produce large amounts of insects. And you could tell me, okay, but maybe we eat less of the insect and therefore it is better to eat livestock. And even in that case, you would be wrong because we consume more of the animal when we farm insects. Roughly speaking, with the species that we are farming right now, 80% of the insect is being eaten and consumed, whereas it's roughly 40 to 60% for poultry and cows. Pigs are higher because you can pretty much use whatever the pig has on him for something. But it's still lower than insects. So that's a good point. That is something that is correct in the argument by the UN. Every time you raise insects, the resources you put in are going to give you much more back. Which means you reduce transportation costs and you also reduce food waste. And this also means that insects are a much cheaper source of protein. So it's even going to be a good thing for you. If you think that meat is too expensive, you could get 4 times the amount of insects for the same price. You get 4 times the protein. You will be able to buy a pot of cricket powder for 1/4 of the price you would get a pot of whey protein, and whey protein is already cheap. So cricket powder, once the costs go down because production goes up, is going to be extremely, extremely cheap. So these are all things that, as much as you want to look at them, you're not going to have an easy time finding bad things to say about that. And then there's also something that I found extremely interesting, and that is the question of the roach farms of China. So China is a little bit secretive about their roach farms. It's essentially gigantic factories where there's billions of roaches. They spend their day eating food waste for the most part that is very hard to recycle. And the Chinese have realized that you can just feed it to roaches because they don't produce gases. So it's like a black hole in a sense, where they take things that would have produced gases and pollution and be very expensive to recycle. You give it to the roach, they eat it, it costs you nothing, and that's it. It just disappears in nature. So China has figured out a way to literally turn garbage into food, because some of these farms also then transform the roach into a food source, be it in protein powder or into food directly. Now, let me be clear with you. I would rather die than eat a roach. I will go hungry and die of starvation before I eat a roach. But it's a different culture. Apparently, they have found a way to make it work. So that is very interesting. And I want to point out one thing here, to balance what I'm saying right now, because you're going to start to think that I work for the UN. Yes, I am French, but I have not yet become an agent of globalism. So in this case, what we see with the insects and the fact that they can transform waste into food is an old concept, a concept that has been existing for thousands of years in Europe and in different parts of the world. That is known as permaculture. Permaculture is raising animals and raising crops on the same land and allowing their interactions to benefit one another. So for example, you raise chicken on land where you also raise corn. And what it does is that the chicken are going to eat the bugs, so they're going to serve as pest control. They're also going to shit on the land, and it's going to make the land more fertile, allowing the vegetables to grow. You can feed some of the vegetables to the chicken, and it's a very virtuous cycle. The reason why almost no one remembers that this used to be the mean of production for agriculture is because we did away with that entirely. Now we are employing industrial agriculture, where the animal has been completely ejected from the equation, and we use machines instead to hype up production to get more and more and more. We force the soil to be fertile by dumping fertilizer all over it. We get rid of the bugs by using pesticides, all things that of course are not sustainable at all. But when we discuss insect protein and the fact that apparently it's sustainable, you have to keep in mind that there are other means to be sustainable. People who tell you that it's insects or nothing, that we have to get rid completely of the way we're doing things right now, no. We could go back to more sensible ways of doing things. Eating bugs is one option. China does that, it's their way of production and their culture. Europe doesn't have to do that. Europe could just go back to permaculture, but of course it would mean reducing production, losing on capital, and it's something that will never happen. The government will never let it happen. I want to plant that seed in your head because we're going to get back to that. The entire discussion around the ecological impact and the ethical impact of consuming bugs, first and foremost, correlates with industrial society, right? As long as the consumption of insect and our production doesn't take us out of it, then it's completely useless. It's a little bit of a spoil, but we're going to get back to that. I don't want to be lost. So, right now, I corroborated some of the UN findings about the fact that it's easier to produce insect proteins, and that for the most part, insects tend to be more sustainable, and we tend to eat more of the insect that we produce. So this is excellent. And this also raises an interesting question. If, pragmatically speaking, insects are so great, and they're also a great source of protein, why don't we want to eat it? Why is there such a strong resistance? Why will there be a ton of people in the comments that will not listen to my arguments and just say, hey, fuck it, I will never eat insect? Why do I say that I will die before I eat a roach? This is all due to cultural and spiritual factors that are extremely strong in European people of European descent, who do not want to eat bugs. This is what needs to be discussed next. Because if you just stay pragmatic when you say, well, it doesn't make sense, you're going to end up like these idiots at the UN who don't get why the entire planet doesn't want to start eating bugs. It's not because they don't believe that it's going to be a good solution, it's because they simply don't want to. But because discussing spirituality is for the most part a question of subjectivity, I want to reserve that to the end of this discussion. Right now, I want to balance all of the positive things I just said about farming insects, because objections are already getting raised. Many people are already raising an eyebrow, and I sort of started talking about that when I discussed the industrial complex that is still part of farming insects and that is still the prevailing force in modern society. So, first and foremost, the farming of insects occurs in conditions far worse than other animals. If you're the type of person that wants to reduce animal suffering, you also understand that industrial farming is the enemy. This is what needs to be targeted first and foremost. This is what makes animals suffer. Insects, the way they're being farmed and raised right now, is that times 100. If you've seen the way chicken get treated in captivity, the way cows and pigs get beaten up in captivity, insects is much worse, right? They are packed in boxes, they don't get enough water, the only water they get is from evaporation, they eat one another, their species die by the tens of thousands in the corpses never get cleaned up. All of that is a nightmare. If we look at the reason for these conditions, it's because they are smaller. And because they are smaller, you can pack a ton of them in boxes. Go look up right now insect farms. The farm is just boxes stacked on one another in a hangar, in a factory. That's it. That's what they call farming. There's almost no work to do, which by the way, is the reason why some industries and some people hype up this production so much, is because it's super easy. It costs almost no money. The cost production of the insect is fairly low because they spend almost nothing producing these things. And I'm sure that you could look at that and say, well, it doesn't matter, they're stupid insects, and on top of that, that's how they live, right? You lift up a rock, you see a ton of insects crawling on another. So if they do that in nature, surely they also like doing that in real life. Well, you take cows that live outside and are relatively free, they huddle up all the time because they live in a society and they like one another. You put them all in a very tiny place, cramped up, yeah, sure, they're also close to one another, but now they don't have a choice. So it's a strange argument. And on top of that, just because it seems to replicate their natural habitat doesn't mean that it comes without a price, because animals that live in nature tend to be much healthier. It's why people favor eating wild-caught fish. It's because the ratio of parasites in wild-caught fish is almost nothing. Whereas all of these disgusting circles in the sea where they dump thousands of salmon produces sick fish, and fish that then you eat. So guess what it's going to do to your health? The reason why I wanted to point that out is because there are interesting studies that came out regarding the parasite content of bugs. Something that I'm sure surprises some of you, because you think, what, bugs? Bugs can have parasites? I thought the bug was the parasite. No. Bugs can have parasites. And actually, swarms of bugs found in farms throughout Europe were found to have a much higher concentration of parasites, with certain studies showing an 80% infection rate. 80% out of 10 insects, 8 are infected with parasites. And this was a very serious study. If anyone wants it, I can link it for you guys, that actually went and observed 300 farms in Central Europe, and out of the 300, 244 had infections with a ton of parasites. And 81 of these 300, so that's 30%, presented parasites that could contaminate humans. So almost 1 out of 3 insects was potentially dangerous to human consumption. And here I want to point out one thing that's interesting. We're talking about Europe here, right? We're not talking about like bumfuck nowhere Africa, right? It's 2 guys from the bush that are just farming crickets like assholes. These are from countries that have regulations. Well, the European Union has a say in the matter. And even with that, we are faced with a parasite infestation. Now, let's balance this out a bit, because I have actually watched a video by a guy who was clearly on the anti-bug side of the argument, who pointed that out and said, okay, this shows that humans cannot eat bugs, it's way too dangerous. First and foremost, this was from live insects. Live insects that once cooked lose most of their parasites. It does not mean that they're safe for consumption, but it's disingenuous to pretend that all insects you're going to eat are going to be full of parasites. On top of that, only 30% were dangerous to humans, and most of them you're going to digest just fine. They're not going to be able to reproduce. But it's still a concern, all right? And it's actually a concern that this study I read pointed out, where they said that for insect consumption to become safe to humans, there needed to be radical changes in the means of production, because if no change is done, it's going to lead to problems. Look at the amount of disease that are caught by people who eat animals that are infected by something, and then it transfers to humans and it starts outbreaks. And if we all have to stay at home for 2 years because someone ate a cricket that was infected with something, what does it mean for insects? Well, the issue with insects is that now their small sizes become a big disadvantage. It saves you time if you just pack them in a box and you farm them industrially. But if you want to farm them free range, how are you supposed to farm free range insects? Free range worms? How is that going to be possible? I'm sure there is a possibility, but it seems to me that insects are built to be farmed industrially. It's like packed in a box and left to just develop and then fed to humans. And if we were to observe that alongside other numbers I collected, roughly 10% of cows were positive for intestinal parasites, meaning that insects, for the most part right now, tend to be much more prone to actually having parasites inside them. The conditions are not proper, and it's because the industry is developing. So it might actually go down eventually, but it was something that must be pointed out, because if we're going to increase the consumption of insects, it needs to be safe. If it's just going to make people sick, I don't really see the point. Now, let's move on to what I think is the most interesting part of the discussion, and that is the morality aspect. Because the consumption of insects is going to bring a very interesting conundrum on the table for vegans. If you're a vegan, technically you don't eat animals. Are you going to eat insects? Because I've heard people say that insects are not animals. That's receivable. I mean, it's subjective. If you decide that, scientifically it might not be sound, but in terms of veganism, if you're going to refuse to cause suffering, unless you can exclude insects from suffering and say that they don't suffer, which by the way was an argument used for lobsters back in the days when people say, oh, just toss them in the thing boiling, they don't feel anything. And nowadays apparently people have switched their minds about that. It's going to be the same with insects. So what do you do now? Do you refuse to eat insects because it's suffering? Knowing full well that if you ate insects, it would reduce the overall production of beef. Because even if you don't eat animal products yourself right now, you could participate in the destruction of the livestock and cattle industry by promoting the bug industry. So I don't know, I'm not vegan personally, but I think that this is a morality question that is going to start becoming more and more prevalent with the year. Because certain animal welfare activists have already started to point out the fact that insects might be sentient. Even though we think right now they don't feel pain, that's based on our understanding. You will have come to understand at this point that the only animals that we like and we try to protect are the ones that look like us or have intelligences similar than us, meaning that they work on the same mode. And you will also find out that most of them are mammals. So we really do protect our own. But when you look at an insect, you feel absolutely nothing. I show you a kitty cat, you're going to want to play with it because it's a kitty cat. I show you a roach, you're going to want to step on its face. Why? The roach did nothing wrong. And when people say, oh, they're dangerous, they're not. They don't really carry disease. At this point, we have figured out that they're fairly clean. They just eat your food and they're in your house. So why do you kill it? If it was a rabbit, would you kill it? The rabbit eats your garden or whatever, your tomatoes. Are you going to step on its face? Most likely not. And that is a very interesting part of the discussion. It's what is known as speciesism. Speciesism is thinking that animals are below humans and therefore it allows us to have the ability to eat them because they're not like us. Vegans think, and I'm going to stop there because I'm already starting to get started on vegans. I'm going to make a full video about veganism at some point. Vegans think that they're anti-speciesist because they include other animals in their respect circle. But if you don't include insects, you're also a speciesist. So I just wanted to say that. Some vegans that want to be more inclusive in their practice believe that treating bugs in such a manner is not ethical. And when you find out the fact that we already at this point, in this early stage of development, farm and kill 1 trillion bugs a year, you also find out that the animal suffering is massive. And on top of that, the vast majority of the production, as I said, is fed to chickens. So bugs were supposed to be introduced as a more ethical and ecological replacement for livestock farming, but right now the only thing they do is they're being fed to livestock. So it promotes the industry. An important part and something that you can retort to people who tell you that bugs are going to save the planet. Right now, the only thing that bug production is doing is it's highly accelerating the death of the planet because it is boosting the industries. And you could tell me, well, you could repeat what I told you, that it's going to take time, and when the transition is over, bugs are going to take over. That is possible. But keep in mind that industries responsible for factory farming, industrial farming, might not want that to happen, and they might find a way to just increase the production of bugs, increase the production of livestock and meat, meaning that overall we're just going to produce more, we're going to pollute more, etc., etc. The farming of bugs right now is not an alternative to factory farming, but a supplier. And now we're going to pivot a bit. Because if we're going to talk about alternatives, we also have to question why we need an alternative in the first place. And I've already spoken about it as if it was just accepted, but it is now widespread in our culture, in Western culture, that eating animals, eating meat, especially cattle and beef, is bad for the planet. So we are trying to find a replacement for it so that we can save the planet. As I said, I think that this is only one option. The other option would be to just reduce the consumption and not replace it with bugs. On top of that, we could also modify the means of production and the means of farming and go back to permaculture. This would reduce the amount, but if people eat less, it's going to be just fine. And it's an important thing to mention because insects throughout cultures have never been a priority. They've never been a main protein source. There's not a single type of people on Earth, I don't care where you go, even in the depth of the Amazon forest, that eat bugs as their number one source of protein. It's always an extra. And funnily enough, it's also the case for animals. For the most part, beyond the ones that only eat bugs, gorillas, for example, they eat ants, but it's an extra. It's a small portion of their proteins. And it also goes for people who traditionally have always eaten bugs. Asians, for example, in certain parts of Asia eat bugs, but it's not their main source. They still eat other sources of protein, and it's mostly animals. Same for Africa. I read an article that said that we needed to eat bugs because it was going to save not only the planet, but also poor people, because they were going to have the ability to have a cheaper protein source, and it's going to make sure they have a balanced nutrition. That's true for the most part, but if you tell an African, hey, do you want a chicken leg or do you want a roach? They're going to tell you chicken leg. They're going to go for the chicken leg. And this is an important part to point out because, as I said, the taste and the desire aspect of the entire thing is to be taken into account. You can't bully people into eating bugs when they have other choices. And as I've proven to you, insect production might not resolve anything, and we could just go back a different route. We could actually modify the way we produce. And this is why Europeans, for the most part, are resisting that. It's not just a spiritual thing, and we're going to get back to the spiritual thing. It's also that, logically speaking, sustainable agriculture looks like a better option. Why are we going the modern route of trying to do something new, of trying to put insects in the mix and say insects are going to save everything? The insects are just the next step in industrial farming. It's not going to solve anything. It's just the continuation of the beast. The beast is just getting bigger and bigger. What needs to happen instead is the demolition of the beast. Insects can be farmed, but they need to be farmed sustainably, and they need not be farmed in the condition they are farmed right now. That was just a small aparté in the entire discussion, since, and this is pretty much the bulk of my argument, and the reason why I told you that I thought this part of the video was much more interesting than talking about proteins. The production of insects remains industrial and is far from an ecological revolution, and is certainly not sustainable. When you see people tell you insects are sustainable, ask them how. How is this sustainable? Because if it costs less to produce, it's not sustainable. It's economical. It means that it's going to create more revenue for the person that creates it, and it's going to be cheaper for the consumer. But it might not be sustainable. They produce less greenhouse gases. Okay, slightly less, but they still need to be transported. That's not sustainable. They require less food to be developed. Okay, but if we just increase the consumption of them, it doesn't change anything. And then you can go down with all of the arguments I already presented to you, like the fact that, yes, they eat garbage, but who is going to want to eat insects that were fed garbage? With all that I presented to you, all of these arguments, all of the things that clearly point out to insects being a possible alternative, but also the fact that they are coming with a lot of problems. Why exactly, if insect consumption is so controversial, are news outlets, companies and celebrities promoting it so aggressively? Why did every single website I found promote eating insects? Where is that coming from? It's not in line with our culture. All of these websites were Western websites from Western companies. Why are they doing that? Why is the news telling you to eat insects? Why are government agencies telling you to eat insects? Where is that coming from? Is it that they all came up with the realization that it's going to save the planet? Well, if they were objective and used logic, they would see, because they have the same data that I have, that it's not going to work like that. And many people have realized it. No, insects are not going to save the planet. No, it's not going to be that great green revolution. That's bullshit. So it must be something else. And when you're faced with something else, if you're not blue-pilled and you don't think that it's just because governments want the best for you, or that's the governments that push ecology actually do it because they want to save the planet, even though 80% of all pollution is created by the industries that are never restrained and can pollute as much as possible, and you're the idiot who has to reduce consumption, etc., etc., you come up with two answers. The first one is the conspiracy one. Right? I'm sure that you've heard about that. If you spend some time on image board, I'm sure that you have. It's the Eat the Bugs meme, the Klaus meme, the UN meme. And that is that this propaganda, this new trend of trying to get us, to force us to eat the bugs, is an attempt at humiliating the population by forcing us to consume what is essentially living trash. The logic in that is that Western civilizations perceive insects, and have always perceived insects, as dirty. Not something that you put in your mouth, not something that you eat. Making their consumption a form of spiritual and cultural suicide. Again, it's an attempt at humiliation. It's an attempt at modifying history, modifying the culture of the people. And when you modify the culture of the people, you modify their nature, especially if you force them to do it. Any country that has been invaded was forced to modify their ways to suit the invaders, and it's never for their good. It's always for the good of the invader, and it's always eventually going to cause either rebellion, or it's going to cause, again, a form of suicide and a form of submission. At some point, you submit. But the submission is not going to occur that easily, because many people, you maybe, refuse to eat the bugs, and you will always refuse to eat the bugs. So there are strategies put in place according to this quote-unquote conspiracy theory, and that is that to get us to eat bugs, they flaunt their perceived benefits with one hand. So it's what I told you at the start, it's the 1-2 punch. The one hand is protein, they're good for you, it's sustainable, whatever. And then the second hand is the guilt tripping. The guilt tripping, which is people who tell you, hey, you're a bad person because you take a shower, you eat meat, so you're a murderer, you're killing the planet. If you ate the bugs and you didn't shower anymore, you would save the planet, even though the industries around you pollute twice as much to make up for it. So it's that constant guilt tripping that is trying to get you to renounce meat. And it's doing that again by shaming you because you have irresponsible habits, you have environmentally irresponsible habits that you need to renounce right now. And one of these habits is eating meat. It's eating animal products. But eating animal products is part of the European lifestyle. It's part of the European culture. And you will hear many silly arguments to get you to actually jump. And this is something that I read in an article, I shit you not. You already eat 500 grams of insects per year in all the products that you consume, so why not do it willingly, right? Why not put it in your mouth willingly, because you are already doing it? These people tell you, hey, you're already sold. You've already been sold, so now you're dirty and you can eat dirty things. This is why people rebel, and this is why people don't want to eat it. They clearly see that all of this hype around bugs is there for a reason. It's because no one wants to fucking eat them. You don't have to hype up red meat. People love red meat. It's delicious. You don't have to hype up fries. People will eat fries. If you have to constantly psychologically bombard people with eat the bugs, save the planet, it's good for you, it's less greenhouse, all of that shit, this must mean that something is up. This must mean that it's not good for you. And most people, me included, are extremely suspicious when the media tells us to do something because they lie so much that at this point, I don't see why we should actually follow whatever they say. And this means that most people, most Europeans, most Westerners, will absolutely refuse to eat bugs, even if they're faced with arguments that point to the fact that bugs can be okay, like I did today. I think I offered a fairly balanced explanation. This will not suffice because, as I said, this is not about being pragmatical, this is about being spiritual. Spiritually, European people do not want to eat bugs. And if you know how morality functions, morality is not based on facts, it's not based on utilitarianism, it is based on feelings. You decided that you want to do this, you don't want to do that, and then you create an entire system around it where you justify your choices. I think, this is a long video, I think I spoke about that at the start of the video. So it's absolutely impossible to make people change their mind on it. Someone who says, I will not eat the bugs, will not be eating the bugs, whatever happened. And the people that push that, again, according to this theory, know that for a fact. So as for the people who will still refuse to eat the bugs, there will be other means put in place to strong arm you into eating them. Like, for example, pricing you out of other protein sources by taxing livestock production or buying up farmland. Things that are happening right now. Coincidentally, meat is extremely expensive. It might get to a point where meat is so expensive that your only way to get animal quote-unquote protein is going to be to eat insects. And you think, oh, I will never do that, maybe you won't, but most people don't have nobility, and the second that they are left in a position where the only product available is insect protein, they will buy insect protein, and you already know that. You can find videos right now from the UN where you have people who have jobs at the UN, right? That are not just janitors, who discuss the fact that if people refuse to transition to insect proteins, we can employ things like human engineering to force them to eat insect proteins. For example, there is a certain type of bug, and it's called the Lone Star tick, I think, and this can give you a disease that makes you allergic to meat. And it was crazy because the guy was discussing that with a smile on his face, saying, hey, if people refuse to eat bugs, we can just infect them with that, and then they're going to be allergic to meat and they won't have a choice. The guy was discussing that like openly. He also discussed the fact that eating bugs, and I didn't verify this, it's what he said, I guess he's right, he's a scientist for the UN, he was discussing the fact that eating bugs made you smaller. So, not like you're going to eat a bug and shrink, but people who replace meat by bugs from their infancy tend to be much smaller. And the guy was discussing the fact that it would be a great thing because smaller people pollute less. And they take less to transport, they take less space, etc., etc. So it's essentially a guy who was discussing the creation of a smaller, weaker race, all of that for the sake of saving the planet. So now you better understand, I think, why so many people actually buy into that theory. And why even those that don't go as far into the conspiracy rabbit hole will also point out to the fact that the Eat the Bugs movement is not for our good. It's for other people's good, but certainly not for yours. On the other hand, of course, the 1% will continue to eat steak and to pollute while reigning over a sea of slaves. The propaganda around eating bugs is to get you to eat bugs, not them, not the 1%, not the people in charge. They pay for the propaganda, but they will continue with their way of living. And I think it's not too crazy to say, because when you look at pollution and transportation in particular, how many times do you see celebrities tell you, hey, stop taking the car, stop taking the plane to go on vacation for the 2 days you have a year where you can relax, whereas they have a private yacht, they have a private plane, and they pollute 1,000 times more than you. All of that is highly hypocritical, and it's the reason why so many people actually believe in that. They believe that none of it is based on reality, that eating the bugs is not going to be a solution, it's just a trap. It's just a method to emotionally manipulate people, to fearmonger, to force people to espouse a new mode of life that is not going to be conducive to their happiness, but that is going to help the 1% continuously devour the planet, hype up their own consumerist ways, while at the same time guilt-tripping you and making you feel bad for daring breathing the oxygen that they breathe, for daring actually eating good and real food. That is the number one answer, the answer to why are the medias pushing that so aggressively, why are the governments pushing that so aggressively. Apparently, it's to create a new race of bugmen, docile creatures who end up resembling the insects they eat. And this is when we tie back into philosophy. If you know Eastern philosophy, You are what you eat. And many people will tell you that the reason why Europeans and Westerners resist eating bugs is because they perceive instinctively that consuming bugs is going to turn them into bugs. Almost as if it were going to have a deep reaction at the DNA level that is going to turn you into a Kafkaesque creature. Whether you believe in that or not, I'm sure that science at this point has debunked it, and that you can eat like muskrat for the rest of your life and never turn into one. Many people don't think like this. Many people, again, stick to the spiritual. They don't give a fuck about the rest, all of the data, all of the evidence, all of the pragmatic information. And all they know is that they will not eat the bugs because they don't want to turn into one. So that was for the conspiracy answer. And then we have the pragmatical answer, the one that quote-unquote makes the most sense because it's based on more data, and it's personally the one that I espouse. And the pragmatical answer as to why everyone and their mother is hyping up eating the bugs is because this is just another hype engineered by the media to push a new product, which will ultimately fail to make a real difference, but will temporarily boost the stock market and the economy. I personally function like this. Every single time I see a conspiracy, I don't see vampires, I don't see people rubbing their hands and drinking baby blood. What I see is people who want to make money. Once you put money at the center of everything, your eyes are open because that's most of the time the answer. What I see with this entire eat the bugs thing is people who saw that bugs could make for an okay replacement for other types of protein sources. They also saw that you could sort of manipulate some arguments to present them as more ecologically viable. And there they go, right? It still is, again, the good old system of consumerism that just is taking another shape. It's morphing into a bug now and is going to try and sell more products. Cricket protein, all of these insect snacks, all of these things being pushed to you, all of that is for the sake of profit. It was never for any other sake. The reason why it was packaged with morality and ethicality and ecology is because this is now the way to protect your investments. It's what we call on image boards moral fagging. I'm sure you've heard the term. For some of you who don't know, you might think I just used a slur, and technically I did. Moral fagging is the practice of pushing morality onto others, even though you don't believe in it yourself, for cookie points or to manipulate people. Again, keep in mind what I said. Morality is mostly feelings. If you can manipulate people's feelings, their brains stop working. Most people have never put in the work I put in today to actually find out whether or not eating the bugs is going to save the planet. And therefore, they just believe. Their heart believes, they believe it's going to do something, so they espouse it, it makes them feel like better people, and this is how it works. Most people are mediocre, most people want to be seen as a good person by the group, and so they will instinctively embrace whatever the media tells them to do, the media that is in cahoot with the politicians and the industries, which only want to make money. So ultimately, this is what I see. It's just another hype. It's going to be fairly temporary. And the reason why I say it's a hype is because you just have to look at the type of companies that pushed it. I saw Adidas push eating the bugs, telling athletes, hey, stop eating meat, you bigot, eat the bugs. This is a company that uses slave labor. They employ tiny Asian children that die in their factories to create shoes. Who are these people to tell you you're a bad person and use morality as an argument? Well, I don't know, but they keep doing it, and every single big company does it. I'm already feeling myself getting out of touch with reality, so look at Nike. Nike that promotes racial equality in the US, whereas again they use slave labor in China. Do they have a heart? Do they have an integrity? Do they have consistency? Absolutely fucking not. They will do what it takes to sell products. Look at the UN. You can believe what you want about the UN, that they're working towards a globalist government, the New World Order, and the New World Owner also, owner with an S. It's fine. I mean, you can believe what you want. What I see is people who are generally incompetent and who are just out there for their own benefit. They always do what benefits them the most. And right now, because they're pushing the ecology scam, which doesn't mean that I don't believe in ecology. I believe in real ecology, meaning renouncing consumerism, turning our back to modernity for the most part, moving away from the industrial complex, etc., etc. These people do absolutely none of that. They continue in the same path, but what they do instead is they change flavor. Right? Yesterday it was chocolate-flavored industrial complexes and modernity. Tomorrow it's going to be vanilla. You'll see it's going to be much better. Yeah, of course. That's bullshit. And the reason why I think that the ecological explanation doesn't hold much salt is because if we truly wanted to quote unquote save the planet and reduce pollution, we would tackle the number one factor of it, which is food waste. As I told you when we discussed greenhouse gas emission, the portion that is the most important is transportation. It's not the animal itself. And it's the same way in this discussion here. We're supposed to save the planet because we're going to run out of resources, but that's not true. 1/3 of all that we produce on this planet is thrown into the trash. That's a large amount of food, enough food to feed every single person on Earth by far. So why are we focusing on producing more food, aka insect protein, instead of not throwing away the one that we produce right now? Well, it's because this would reduce growth. It would reduce capital because we would have to go back, we would have to reduce the numbers. And the number one thing that this consumerist society does not want to do is to reduce numbers because they're going to lose on profits. But in terms of sustainability, that is the way to go. So anytime you meet someone who tells you, hey, save the planet, and their solution is not reduce consumerism and move to a mean of consumption that prioritizes eating everything we produce, then you know you're talking to a clown, someone who is not logical, someone who has been completely manipulated, and who will most likely at some point eat the bugs. And this is why the arguments don't rely on logic, it relies on emotional manipulation to push sales. Just like they're doing with the insects, as I've proven to you. None of that is based on reality. There are a few good arguments for consuming insects, but every single good reason for consuming insects can also concern other types of animal products. At the end of the day, what needs to happen is a modification of the modes of production and the modes of consumption. But they don't do that because their concern has always been economical growth as opposed to ecological sustainability. It is money that is at the center of their interests. Celebrities, the ones that you see on the media, I saw DiCaprio, I saw Angelina Jolie, I saw the guy who plays Iron Man. All of these people are also promoting eating bugs. Why do they do that? Well, it's because celebrities are attention whores and they always pile up on the hype train every time there is something new because they want to be seen, they want to stay relevant, and therefore they are being utilized as tools of this consumerist society to push products onto dumb people, maybe you if you still listen to celebrities. So they're fighting to maintain their status, and the people in charge actually blackmail them with that, telling them, hey, do this, do that, be a good puppet. If you want to stay relevant, if you want to still be on TV, you better promote whatever we say. You promote all of that again for the sake of making more and more money. And at the bottom of that, you have, of course, the media, the mass media that relays all of this information to the useful idiots, which is the reason why you see so much of that in the media. It's not a global conspiracy. It's just that whenever a news outlet starts talking about something, they all do it. They all pile up on it. It's the news cycle. It's how it works. And it creates a bubble. Right now, we are looking at the Eat the Bugs bubble. Some people want to turn that bubble and use it to push ecological agendas. Some people want to make money off of it, etc., etc. At some point, the bubble is going to pop. And the people that are going to suffer from it are the useful idiots of the system that embrace whatever is promoted by the media and celebrities for social brownie points, again, to be good people. Look at me, I eat bugs, I'm saving the planet, I'm not a murderer, even though technically I'm eating a living being and I'm eating hundreds of them instead of just one. So I'm creating much more suffering, but it's okay because they're insects. In my weird way of seeing the world, insects are not really animals, so it doesn't matter. All of that is, of course, the height of hypocrisy, and this is what I personally see. When I see this entire thing, Eat the Bugs, I see the pragmatical side of people trying to make money, slave morality being utilized to make money, emotional manipulation, moral fagging, all methods that have always been used by this society whenever they want to create something new for you to consume. And that is going to conclude this video. I knew that the second part was going to be fucked up. It's always the same with me. I start with a reasonable head and solid arguments, and then it starts just ramping up. It's what being French is, I guess. So now let us conclude this video. Conclusion is going to be much faster, you will see. While insects do offer a valid source of protein, they are not the promised revolution in terms of nutrition, and a lot of work will have to be put in to optimize the production process both in terms of safety and sustainability. That's that. Now, before I let you go and let you ponder the question of whether or not you should eat the bugs, I will eventually put out a video where I record a taste test, because as I told you, I eat bugs. And we can set up a kitchen table with crickets, with egg whites, with whey powder, with all sorts of a protein. And what I want to do is I want to compare them all. I want to compare the taste, the amount of proteins, the bioavailability, the fats, the carbs, etc., etc. I think it's going to be great fun. Let me know in the comments if you would be interested, and I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.